Robert F. Kennedy Jr. pulled into the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, a modest spot in the middle of Greenfield, Massachusetts, the kind of place that had been around for decades. Its neon sign flickering slightly, the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee slipping through the crack of the door every time someone walked in or out. He had heard about it from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. He was exhausted. A long day of handshakes, policy discussions, and travel had worn him down. All he wanted was a quiet meal before the drive back. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The place was small but welcoming. At least that's how it felt at first. The kind of diner where the same handful of regulars occupied the same booths every night, where a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and brewed coffee, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. RFK Jr. caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile until she recognized him. It was quick, barely a second, but he noticed it. A hesitation. The kind that flickered across a person's face when they suddenly weren't sure what to do. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. He glanced around. A few customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. Another, a woman in a flannel shirt, set down her coffee cup a little too hard, eyes narrowing just slightly before looking away. RFK Jr. wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms to sense when he wasn't entirely welcome. But a diner? Here? The hostess hesitated, then stepped forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Good evening, she said, her voice careful. Are you dining in or taking out? RFK Jr. let out a small, tired chuckle. Dining in, if that's all right. Another pause. Too long for a simple question, actually. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. I need to check something real quick. Just one moment. She disappeared through the swinging door. RFK Jr. was left standing there. A few more heads turned his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered something under their breath. Something wasn't right. Seconds stretched. Behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct to make out. RFK Jr. exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to assume anything either. Maybe there was a policy. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe... The hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. I'm sorry, sir, she said, her voice firmer now. We can't serve you tonight. But the way she said it, the way the whole room seemed to tighten around her words, made it clear this wasn't about business. This was personal. For a brief moment, RFK Jr. said nothing. The words just sat there between them, thick and heavy. The diner had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere. But the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were watching, waiting. RFK Jr. studied the hostess's face. She wasn't hostile, just firm, like she'd made up her mind. Or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His eyes flicked past her toward the kitchen window. A pair of cooks stood just beyond the counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates, their expressions unreadable. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong? The hostess didn't fidget this time. It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy, no. "We're closing soon." Just that. RFK Jr. let his hands settle on his hips, exhaling through his nose. He'd been in his fair share of uncomfortable situations, debates, interviews designed to trip him up. But there was something different about being turned away from a place as simple as a roadside diner. A cough broke the moment. RFK Jr. turned slightly, catching the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. The guy looked like he'd been coming here for years, his blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs, hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, like he was enjoying the show. RFK Jr. took it all in. The eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had options. He could walk out, shake his head, let it go. He could demand an explanation. Call them out. Ask if they had any idea what this would look like in the morning news cycle. He could challenge them outright. See if they'd stick to their decision when they realized they were refusing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Instead, he did none of those things. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. His voice was even, measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen, as if asking for silent permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually going through with this. RFK Jr. just stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few more beats of silence, a sip of coffee, a plate being slid across the counter. Then the door swung open, and a man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, John. John didn't ask RFK Jr. what he wanted. He just looked him over once, then said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming, wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. RFK Jr. met John's stare, steady, unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to just walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," RFK Jr. said, "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." John exhaled sharply through his nose, like he'd been expecting the question, but still wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing toward the handful of customers still watching the exchange. Some pretended not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. John let out a breath, arms still crossed over his chest. "You want to know why?" he repeated, like the answer should have been obvious. RFK Jr. held his ground. "Yeah." The diner had gone from quiet to dead still. Even the clatter from the kitchen had stopped. A waitress near the coffee station hovered, pretending to wipe down the counter. A few regulars had abandoned their meals entirely, eyes flicking between John and RFK Jr. John exhaled through his nose again, shaking his head. "It's not personal," he said. RFK Jr. arched a brow. "Doesn't feel that way." John's jaw tightened. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "we don't want trouble here." RFK Jr. studied him. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came here for a meal." John shifted his weight, glancing at the handful of customers still listening in. A younger man, sitting by the window, let out a small scoff and muttered, "Yeah, right." RFK Jr. heard it. So did John. And something in John's posture changed. He looked tired all of a sudden, like a man who didn't want to be having this conversation, but also wasn't going to back down from it. "We're a small place," John said finally. "A local spot, and we like to keep it that way." RFK Jr. frowned. "And I don't qualify as local." John didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch until the meaning became clear. This wasn't about local. It was about him, who he was, what he stood for, or at least what they thought he stood for. RFK Jr. let out a slow breath. "I see," he said, nodding once. Something flickered in John's expression. Not regret, not hostility. Something more like resignation. Like he knew this moment would stick with him. Would probably end up in the news, whether he liked it or not. But he'd already made his choice. RFK Jr. could have called him out. Could have made a scene. Could have let the emotions rising in his chest push him towards something loud and confrontational. But he didn't. Instead, he did something no one in that room expected. He smiled. Not a big, forced grin, not a smirk, just a small, knowing smile. And then, he reached into his pocket. The movement made a few people stiffen, like they weren't sure what he was about to pull out. A wallet, a phone, a statement. But instead, RFK Jr. simply pulled out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter. "For the waitress," he said, his voice calm. "She shouldn't lose a tip just because I wasn't welcome." The room stayed silent. Even John looked caught off guard for a second. RFK Jr. gave him a small nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The bell above the door jingled as it swung shut behind him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then, "That was unexpected," the older man at the counter muttered. The waitress hesitated, glancing at John. He sighed, shaking his head, then gave her a nod. She picked up the $20, tucking it into her apron. Outside, RFK Jr. climbed into his car, turned the key, and as he pulled away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Through the diner's window, a few people were still watching him go, and John was still standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but something in his stance had changed, like a man who wasn't entirely sure if he'd just won, or if he'd lost something much bigger. The next morning, the story was everywhere, and by noon, people from all over were calling Rosie's Diner, some to support them, others to let them know they'd never be stopping by again. But one thing was certain: no one in that diner would forget that night anytime soon. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.